Welcome. Thank you for joining again. Before coming to the detailed discussion of each of the 30 or so contract types, we have to cover yet the important issue of sign. Signs can drive you crazy. You might have experienced this when writing a formula of some length. Did you recognize all the signs and put them correctly? Was the final sign, after all the pluses and minuses, correct? The final result can only be plus or minus, but how easy is it to get it wrong? The formula might be very complex, but the most complex thing is often the sign. I remember sign problems where we went round for days and we really felt at the brink of sanity. If we were cynic, we could say that there is a 50% chance to get the sign right or wrong. Without even being cynic, my personal experience with signs corroborates this view. The chance to get the sign right in the first round is no more than 50%. And imagine calculating contracts in the 100,000 millions or maybe billions. How can you keep track of the correct signs? The only solution is to solve it at the root. Solving the sign problem at the root will keep us sane and protect us from sleepless nights. This is indeed a worthwhile task, since it can protect us from insanity. And it will make also a big difference in practice, because it's a big difference whether you owe somebody else 1,000 or somebody else owes 1,000 to you. And that is expressed by the sign. Getting it wrong is really getting it wrong. So how we solve these problems with Actus is the focus of this tutorial. In order to understand the context, and especially the context of this tutorial, it is essential that you have listened to Actus tutorial 03. This, of course, has its own predecessors. So then, what is the sign of a contract? Positive or negative? Does a financial contract carry a sign? Does it even make sense to talk of signs? Somehow it makes sense if you think in terms of assets and liabilities, since they represent the opposing partners or opposing sides of a contract. What is a plus for one is a minus for the other. However, this introduces also a difficulty. Since the same asset is somewhere else a liability, it looks like the two signs cancel themselves out, leaving us with a neutral object. Another difficulty we can see by looking at this simple PAM, the one we saw before. This PAM represents an asset. It has three cash flows. First the outflow, or the money I give to the debtor, followed by the two inflows, interest and principal, when the debtor has to repay. We can see that even a single transaction seen from a single viewpoint, the creditor, has at the same time in and outflows. What sense does it make attaching a sign to a contract if every financial contract has, by definition, always in and outflows? Still, the signs do make sense. That can be seen if we look at the same PAM from the other side, where it represents a liability. We see that the pattern is the same, save for the direction of the cash flows. Having a sign, having a single sign that makes the job of turning all these cash flows into the right direction is very appealing, and in fact a very elegant solution. Therefore, we need the idea of a sign. The very notion of a flow from cash flow calls for a sign. But one person's outflow is another person's inflow. For this reason, it is indispensable to define whose view it is. Let us first start with the notion of the legal entity identifier, or LEI in short. This is a worldwide unique ID for counterparties developed by the Financial Stability Board, or FSB, in cooperation with the Office of Financial Research, or OFR. The FSB is part of the G20 and could be viewed as a systemic risk body on the global level. The OFR is the counterpart on the US level. The LEI identifies every significant player in the financial sector. I say significant because every person is a player as soon as you have only a saving account, which most of us get at birth, or if you have a mortgage or so on. The intention of the LEI is to capture the big guys, those that can affect the entire system, and to cover small people only by proxies, only as much data as it is needed to perform reasonable analytics, like a rating, for example, or the area where you live, maybe the profession. Let's assume the financial contract under scrutiny is between two big players. Each of them has an individual LEI, but also both have to submit their records to the regulatory level for regulatory purpose. This means at the regulatory level we will get two identical records, save for the sign. So how do we distinguish who is who? We have to introduce two additional attributes. First, we have the LEIRC, or the LEI of the record creator. This is the entity submitting the record. LEICP identifies the LEI of the counterparty to LEIRC. Assume the following deal. A grants a loan to B. In other words, A holds an asset against B and B holds a liability against A. Now A submits the record to the regulator. In this case, LEIRC is A, so they would put A here. They would put B here. And they would say it's an asset. Or in short, has a positive sign. B submits the same record with the following difference. They will have LEI of record creator B, and the counterparty will be A, and they will declare it a liability, or it's a negative contract. We still have to relate this problem to signs. The final step to get the sign right for basic contract is the attribute CNTRL. This one here. Very important attribute. It means contract role. In our previous example, we mentioned that A had to declare the contract as an asset. This happens in this attribute CNTRL. CNTRL has the following state, or states. If it is a simple balance sheet position, it is either RPA for an asset or RPL for a liability. If it is a collateralized position, then this COLA stands for collateralized asset and COLL for collateralized liability. This rule is sufficient for basic contract types, except guarantees and credit lines. Higher order contract types needs sometimes additional logic. However, at the end of the day, it turns the underlying contract in either an asset or a liability, and their corresponding cash flows to in- or outflows. There are only these two states. The additional logic necessary for higher order contract types will be explained in due time. We have solved the problem on the level of cash flows. The cash flow sign solves the problem on the contract level. This is not yet the end of the story. The final report consumed by the management, however, will be rather on the analysis elements level. They will look at value, income, liquidity, for sure, maybe sensitivity, maybe at risk. Here. What about signs on this level? Liquidity is simple, since it is directly linked to cash flows, where we said already that an inflow is positive and an outflow negative. This corresponds also with the common feeling. All liquidity numbers I have seen so far follow these rules. More difficult it is with value. The main question is, should an asset be expressed as positive or a negative number? Intuitive reaction tends to define it as a positive number, since it is more positive to have an asset than a liability. Better to be an owner than being owned. Looking at bookkeeping software, we find, however, the astonishing fact that assets are usually defined as negative and liability as positive. How come? This is my interpretation of the situation. Bookkeepers are prudent by nature. In other words, bookkeepers acknowledge in tendency only facts, which finally can, if it comes to cash flows, only be past events. From this follows, bookkeepers are rather backward looking. Let's look at this PAM. Let's assume we are here, somewhere in the middle of the life of this contract. So a bookkeeper looks back and says, I had an outflow in the past, therefore it is something negative. I gave something, so that's negative. So this is the bookkeeper. On the other hand, we have the risk manager, which by nature is interested in the future cash flow. A risk manager is therefore in tendency rather forward-looking. He or she will say, I will get so and so much cash. Now this is an inflow. Therefore, a positive feeling arises. From these two views, we learn first that the sign of a value is a convention. But which one should we follow? Instinctively, I follow the risk manager, since we are closer to the risk manager than the bookkeeper. This is also the view taken by Actus. Value is defined by the future cash flows. Once this is defined, the rest follows by logic. Since we have already defined inflows as positive, it follows directly as a corollary that an asset has a positive value and liabilities have negative values. Income is closely related to cash flows, to interest cash flows, to value change, and has the same positive sign as the cash flow. Expenses then are negative as a consequence. Sensitivities are derivation of value against any of these risk factors, and they follow strict mathematical rules once assets are defined positively. From this follows, for example, that duration for an asset has a negative sign. The normal definition is that it has a positive sign, but the value drops when the rate goes up. So therefore it must be negative once value is defined positive. So everything follows by strict mathematical rules. The same can be said for risk. Taking all together, we have the following situation. The meaning at the contract level is given through, on one hand, LEIRC, the record creator, the LEI of the record creator, and the attribute contract role. This drives whether the contract is an asset or a liability, which we, by convention, we call plus, we call that minus. If it would be a combined contract type, it would have several levels here, but at the end, at the bottom, we would find either assets or liability. That's the bottom. This decides already the sign, and from this, the underlying cash flows are driven. So for the asset, we have here T, and we have an outflow followed by an inflow. And so that's for the asset. And for the liability, we have again T for an inflow followed by an outflow. So, and then we read everything, all the next level results, they are derived by forward looking. So, because that's an outflow, it's negative, and if you're here forward looking, it's an inflow, that's positive. So value would be shown positive, here negative, income, etc., as we explained before. This system has enormous benefits. It has an internal logical consistency, since all signs relate to each other. More than this, it will make it very easy to aggregate results from the lowest single contract level to any portfolio level, an entire enterprise, a nation even, till even the global level. This applies, however, for the analysis result level, so here, this level, the green part, and not for the calculation of the result. So the calculation of the result rather happens up here, where non-linearity reigns. But once we have the results, we are very, very sign-driven. The power becomes even more clear if we take the linearity or additivity of the system into account. We cannot go into details of this feature right now. At this point, it is sufficient to understand that almost all financial analysis results can be stored in a linear fashion. A part of the result is also nonlinear, but this can be easily encapsulated and treated with in post-processing, absorbing only minimal CPU power. Combining the power of signs and the linearity of this analysis leads to a very simple solution for result aggregation, even under very complex conditions. Save for a few encapsulated nonlinear results, the only command needed to get aggregated result will be sum or add. So sum or add. So always add result. Never use subtraction. This brings us to the end of this tutorial introduction. Thank you for attending and see you in the advanced tutorials.